Chapter 2. Waking up. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled Ash's nostrils as he slowly blinked his eyes open. His head felt heavy, like it was stuffed with cotton, and his limbs were oddly stiff. For a moment, everything was blurry. The ceiling above him was stark white, and the soft hum of machinery and the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the silence. He wasn't outdoors. This wasn't the battlefield against Team Rocket. Where was he? He squinted, his mind sluggish, as he tried to piece together the fragments of memories. Team Rocket. Pikachu. Psyduck. Psyduck's confusion attack. And then, darkness. Ash? The soft, familiar voice cut through the haze, pulling him back to the present. He turned his head slowly and saw a figure sitting beside him, her bright red hair unmistakable even in the dim light of the Pokémon Center room. Misty! His voice came out hoarse, scratchy, like he hadn't spoken in days. Misty leaned forward, her face etched with concern, her hands gripping the edge of the chair she'd been sitting in. "Ash, you're awake," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "How are you feeling? You've been out for hours." Ash groaned softly, rubbing his forehead. His whole body felt off. There was a strange lightness in his limbs, but at the same time, they felt oddly stiff. He struggled to sit up, his muscles protesting slightly. But Misty was there in an instant, her hands gently pressing on his shoulders to stop him. "Careful, careful," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You took a pretty big hit from Psyduck's confusion. It knocked you out cold." Ash blinked, his mind still foggy. Psyduck's confusion, he frowned, trying to remember. I guess I remember that. Everything went blue, and then, I don't know. Everything's fuzzy." Misty nodded, biting her lip. Yeah, Psyduck lost control. I didn't mean to send him out when he wasn't ready, but things got really crazy with Team Rocket. He couldn't handle it. Ash smiled weakly, trying to reassure her. "It's okay, Misty. I mean, this isn't the first time I've been knocked out by a Pokémon attack." Misty didn't seem convinced. She hovered over him, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for any sign of lingering damage. "You sure you're okay? You look a little different." Ash blinked at her words. "Different? What do you mean?" Misty hesitated, glancing at him more closely, as if trying to pinpoint what exactly had changed. I don't know. Maybe it's just the lighting, but your face looks softer. And your hair." She reached out, gingerly touching a lock of his dark hair. "It looks longer." Ash's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't looked at himself yet, too focused on the strange sensation running through his body. But now that Misty mentioned it, he could feel it, the weight of his hair brushing against his neck, something that hadn't been there before. He lifted a hand to touch it, his fingers trembling slightly. It was longer. Not by much, but definitely longer than it had been when he last remembered. And it felt softer, smoother, almost like Misty's hair. "No way," he muttered under his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "That's weird." Misty's frown deepened, her brow furrowed in worry. Ash, are you sure you're okay? Maybe we should ask Nurse Joy to run more tests. Psychic energy can do weird things sometimes." Ash shook his head, though the motion made him slightly dizzy. No, I'm fine. Really, it's probably just from being knocked out. My body's just adjusting, I guess." He tried to reassure himself, but something gnawed at the back of his mind. His hands felt strange too. He hadn't noticed it at first, but now, as he looked down at them, he saw that his fingers were thinner, more delicate. His palms were smoother, his usually rough and calloused skin softer, almost like it had been polished. He flexed his fingers experimentally, turning his hands over to examine the backs. It wasn't a huge change, but the difference was there. His hands just didn't look like his anymore. Misty was still watching him closely, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Ash, Ash, if something's wrong, you need to tell me, she said quietly. I don't want you brushing this off just because you think it's no big deal. Sidek's confusion was really powerful. It might have done something more than just knock you out. Ash swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't know. Misty, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I feel weird. My hands, my hair. It's like my body's not mine. Misty's eyes widened, and she reached out, grabbing his hand. We need to tell Nurse Joy right away. You shouldn't be feeling like this. But Ash shook his head again, more firmly this time. No, let's just wait. Maybe it's just temporary. Psychic attacks can mess with your senses. Right. Maybe I'm just feeling weird because of that. Misty didn't look convinced, but she reluctantly nodded. Okay, but if it gets worse, we're going to the Pokemon Center's emergency room. No arguments. Ash nodded, grateful that Misty was willing to give him some time to figure things out. He had to believe that this was just a side effect from Psyduck's attack. There was no way he was actually changing. That was impossible. Pokemon attacks didn't do that. Did they? He sighed, running his fingers through his longer hair again, still struggling to wrap his head around the changes. It felt so strange, so unfamiliar. His hair was soft, almost silky, and it hung down near his neck, brushing against his skin in a way that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. But that wasn't the only thing. His body felt lighter, more delicate. He hadn't noticed it at first, but now that he was fully awake, he could feel it in his limbs. His arms felt slimmer, his shoulders narrower. His entire frame seemed to have shifted, just slightly, but enough for him to notice. It was like his body was shrinking. Ash clenched his fists, trying to push the rising panic back down. This was fine. He was fine. It was just lingering effects from Psyduck's confusion. That had to be it. He wasn't changing. He wasn't. Hey, Misty said softly, her voice pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. You sure you're okay? Ash forced a smile, though it felt shaky on his lips. Yeah, I'm okay. Just a little freaked out, I guess. Misty's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand gently. I'm sorry, Ash. I never should have sent Psyduck into that battle. I didn't think it would. It's not your fault. Ash interrupted, his voice firm despite the unease gnawing at him. You didn't know this would happen. And Psyduck. Well, Psyduck's always been a little unpredictable. Misty let out a soft laugh, though it was tinged with guilt. That's an understatement. For a moment, the tension in the room eased, and they shared a quiet smile. But the unease lingered, heavy and unspoken between them. Misty might not have noticed the full extent of the changes yet, but Ash could feel them, and they weren't going away. As he shifted in the bed, trying to find a more comfortable position, his eyes caught something across the room, a small mirror mounted on the wall beside the door. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at his reflection. His face. It wasn't the same. His jawline was softer, the sharp angles of his chin and cheeks smoothed out. His eyes, though still his familiar brown, seemed wider, more expressive. His lips had a fuller, softer curve to them, and his skin was almost flawless, smooth and pale with a faint pink tint to his cheeks. It wasn't a drastic change, but it was enough to make his heart race in his chest. He looked different. He looked almost like... No, that was impossible. He tore his gaze away from the mirror, trying to steady his breathing. It was just a trick of the light. Or maybe his reflection was distorted from the angle. There was no way he was actually changing. He was still himself. He had to be. Ash? Misty's voice broke through his thoughts again, and he realized she was watching him closely, her eyes filled with worry. He quickly composed himself, forcing another smile. I'm fine, Misty. Really, just tired, I guess. Misty didn't look convinced, but she let it go. For now. Okay, she said softly. But you should rest. I'll stay here with you, just in case. Ash nodded, grateful for her presence. He lay back down, his heart still racing as he tried to push the thoughts away. Maybe if he slept, everything would go back to normal. Maybe when he woke up, his hair would be short again, his hands rough and calloused, his face just as it had always been. But as he closed his eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong.